All right, I'm Dr. David Litwa, and I have a special guest today, Ian Mills, who graduated from Duke in 2021 and has a very fascinating book forthcoming and an article which I want to discuss today, very important one on Marcion. And I think that it's so significant what he's saying that I wanted to bring Ian on and to tell us about it specifically, from his own voice. And so welcome, Ian. Is there anything else that you want to introduce? Okay.
That's me. Thank you so much. I teach at Hamilton College in Classics and Religious Studies. Nope, that's it.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic appointment, and it kind of well fits, Ian. What I like about your scholarship is this ability to contextualize within the Greco-Roman world, that is to reframe. So it involves a little bit of defamiliarization, and then it involves, a recategorizing, and then boom, we get a new description of the reality. And I think that's really essential. I don't know if the history has ever been written of why New Testament studies and classics is so weirdly disjointed and unrelated. But it's thanks to Ian and many others that, like Robin Faith Walsh and others, who are slowly but surely making inroads into this great and amazing classical world, which is also the world of the New Testament. So we want to talk specifically about, first of all, Ian's book. Now, Ian, when has this book come out? And just so that people know, is it out yet officially?
No, it's not. So The Hypothesis of the Gospels is the title. Hypothesis, kind of like the English word, although we'll talk about it. It means something very different in Greek. And it'll be coming out through Fortress Press in November, just in time for SBL. So I think November 4th. Is when the book will come out, but you can find it already on Amazon and on the Fortress Press website if you want to pre-order, should you be so inclined. Hypothesis.
Yes, hypothesis, exactly spelled like the English word. But this has a very distinct sense. And can you tell people about the ancient literary sense of this word hypothesis and what this is about?
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation. So the term hypothesis, I discovered this term when I was looking into actually a project that I never ended up writing, which is about books in antiquity that went under the same title. And so I started looking for all the examples I could find of different people publishing their own books, but all sharing the same title. So publishing a new book, maybe on a predecessor's title or something like that. And when I looked into this, several of the examples I found, so one is Dio Chrysostom, who's a late 1st century, early 2nd century orator and speechwriter, and he writes on the 3 Philoctetes. So 3 different playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all wrote a play on the same name. And likewise, you can look at Diogenes Laertius or Athenaeus as Deipnosophists, and they're talking about the different works about Socrates. So that Xenophon and Plato both wrote an apology, and Xenophon and Plato both wrote a symposium of Socrates, right? And the language they use to describe what these books share, what's in common between these books, is the word hypothesis, hypothesis. And it seems to mean something like substrate. It's a metaphor. And Greek authors in antiquity are already writing that they know this word is used in lots of different ways in different contexts. So there's already a sort of diversity of uses for this term that people are explicit about. But in narrative contexts, this term seems to mean something like notional substrate, something sort of underlying multiple things. So hupo means under, and thesis comes from like tithemi, to like put under. So it seems to be something like the basis or the substrate or it's sometimes an architectural metaphor. So the thing that's like you can't see behind your walls, it's all the studs and the supports and the beams. That's what a hypothesis is. And in narrative contexts, it's used something like how people talk about like the essence. So when somebody talks about the adaptation of a book into a movie, and they say, well, they really captured the essence, or they made this change, but it didn't, affect the essence of the story. They mean something similar to what hypothesis often means for people in antiquity. And this shows up most clearly in the Scholia, where we have excerpts from older commentaries that are sort of going line by line through these plays like the Philoctetes, but like through dramas, as well as through like the Homeric corpus. And these are contexts where people are comparing multiple versions of a story. So Sophocles has made a change to Homer, and they'll use hypothesis to sort of adjudicate whether or not that change is faithful to the hypothesis or whether it hurts the hypothesis. And there's a difference. It's an acknowledged difference, but there's a sort of, it's used to name the territory that people care about, like what they actually care about in a story. There's more I could say, but I've probably over answered the question. So
No, that's fine. So you use the term notional, and I'm just interested in, obviously, if they wanted to, they could write down like what we in English would refer to as like the gist of a story.
Yeah.
And I think Wendy Doniger, in her book, or one of her books, refers to a micro myth that is
nice.
not how the story is told, but it's how the story is boiled down in the minds of people. And then what people do with that sort of base story, that gist, is then they create lots of details, and they're able to tweak lots of stuff. But they still try, in some respect, to keep the base story together. Like in Gnostic studies where I am, this happens all the time, where people say things like, okay, there's many ways of telling the Gnostic myth, but at least in the 20th century, they were saying, well, Valentinus told it this way, Marcion told it this way, Basilides told it this way. But if we boil it down, it goes something like this. There was a split in the Godhead, and part of the Godhead fell, and that part released a seed or spark that comes into the human nature and is imprisoned in the human body. And then that spark, the point of life is to release that spark and to go back to the Godhead. That's the gist of the story. That would be the hypothesis, as it were.
Right.
And then on the base of that would be all these variations that you would get in actual retellings, like the actual stories. So is this, I guess the question then is this mainly a mental kind of thing for the ancients? And if so, does one ancient disagree with another to say, oh, no, this is the hypothesis of the Philoctetes story. It has to have this element. And then someone else could say, no, that's kind of tangential. That's not the core. Do we see disagreements like that?
Yeah, so I think that's certainly the case, that this is something that is notional, is something, it's an abstraction, right? Gist is nice, fabula is the sort of narratological term, and it does seem to have had content. It isn't just like, it isn't any random part of the story. Some authors, specifically again in the Scholia, will say, the hypothesis is constituted by key characters, events, and locations. So like they do feel like it has some sort of structure, at least the term does, in continuity from speaker to speaker, right? But of course, what counts as a key character totally depends who you're talking to. And there's a dissertation by someone who's at Duke at the same time as me, working on the Sophoclean Scholia, sort of looking at the Scholia of Sophocles and Euripides as evidence of these debates. And of course, you only ever get one snippet, but several of these snippets suggest there was an ongoing debate, and over whether or not Sophocles had done wrong in changing who kills Agamemnon precisely relative to Homer. And the hypothesis, or the hypothesis, which is a nice way to sort of capture that we're talking about something different than the word theory in English, seems to be a way to name the territory in some ways. name what we're disagreeing about, what we're disagreeing over. So yeah, we definitely find polemical uses of this term, especially in the Scholia, which is a really nice place because it's the place where you're actually looking over the shoulders, as it were, of a reader, right, and doing the acting of reading as they're sort of annotating alongside their text. In theory.
Right. I mean, I can see, for instance, two scholars getting together in a room and talking about Homer,
Yep.
and then having them say, I think that it's essential to the story that Helen goes to Troy. But then, someone like Stesichorus, he really jiggles with that hypothesis. So he says, no, actually, it wasn't the true Helen who went to Troy. It was just a phantasm, and that the real Helen went to Egypt. And then there's a whole story based on that. And I could see someone, I'm just imagining someone going to Stesichorus and saying, no, you can't do that. That's violating the story.
Yep.
I'm not saying that someone in antiquity actually did this, but I'm just imagining that this happening. So this does happen in antiquity. Yes. We do get disagreements, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. And you see that, like, we're sort of skipping ahead here, but like Epiphanius says that Basilides violated, is breaking the story, is breaking the hypothesis by having Simon crucified instead of Jesus, which I know Basilides didn't actually say that. That's probably a misunderstanding. But for all Epiphanius knows, that's what he said, right? And so he's imagining this other gospel existing and saying this is a violation of the hypothesis. Likewise, we have Scholia that say, this change breaks the story. This change is hurts or damages or destroys the hypothesis. And then likewise, defending some changes, as one of my favorite Sophoclean Scholia says that each author is free to make things happen as they wish, to have it occur, play out the way they want, so long as they preserve the hypothesis. So that's sort of the epigram in my first chapter, is this explicit defense of you can rewrite the story so long as you preserve what this author understands to be the key characters, setting, and events.
Right. And of course they say that, but the first thing that we learn in like a classical mythology course, or at least speaking for myself, is that myth is inherently flexible and people mold it in different ways for different audiences, for different persons. And so the amount of change that is tolerated is going to be different based on, who's reading and interpreting this material, which of course then goes and feeds into these polemical uses of hypothesis. For instance, you mentioned that for Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is this original one who passes on the story of Basilides, Jesus not really being crucified. He also says that Marcion violates the hypothesis, and that's interesting. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on, the rhetorical use of this sort of like it does make sense, but it can also be used as a cudgel. And in the case of, it's interesting that in reconstructions of Marcion's gospel, and I'm thinking of more conservative reconstructions here, like Dieter Roth and Jason Badun, that yes, obviously, it doesn't contain large sections of canonical Luke, but when you look at it in structure and content, beginning with Luke chapter 3 verse 1, and the sermon in Nazareth and the miracles and the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the walk to Emmaus, all that's in there. So I'm wondering, the basic question is this then, that did Marcion, from your sort of modern critical perspective, destroy the hypothesis, or is he just presenting a new variation on a common core?
Yeah, so I want to clarify that what I'm not doing is sort of looking back to classical literary critics or even early Christian interpreters and sort of doing the theological ressourcement, right? I'm not suggesting we should start reading text this way. And so, like, I actually don't think, like, I think that is a kind of normative judgment that depends on kinds of assumptions that I don't, operate with when I'm reading classical texts, and I include in that the New Testament, right? So
Yep.
I'm happy to sort of say, like, it makes perfect sense to me that some people would have seen Marcion's Gospel and thought, oh, another book on the same hypothesis, and other people would have seen Marcion's Gospel and said, well, we know they did. Like, Epiphanius uses the word hypothesis explicitly, and I argue that Irenaeus uses it implicitly. That use this idea of a hypothesis to say, no, this gospel breaks the hypothesis. And so I'm really happy to sort of look into and say, like, so why would Irenaeus have said that, given the fact that, as you're exactly right to point out, Marcion's Gospel looks an awful lot like Irenaeus's Luke. So what makes him say that? And you and I both wish that Irenaeus gave us a long catalog of the things he doesn't like about Marcion's Gospel, right? Wouldn't that be helpful? Unfortunately, like, we don't really get that sort of breakdown. We do get it from Epiphanius, right? We get it, twice. And so, like, we kind of have to speculate about why Irenaeus said that, but I think it's not hard to comprehend. Irenaeus, and I want to talk about Serapion in connection to this too, because I think he's a really useful person to watch someone pivot on their answer to this exact question in the course of their own little, interactions with the Christians in Rosas. But put in Serapion for 1 second. It's easy to see how Irenaeus, reading this in light of what he believes Marcion believes, reads this text and sees passages that, relative to the text he's familiar with, seem to distance Jesus from the God of the Hebrew Bible. We could go through the sort of specific examples of this, but there are a handful of passages where it looks like the text has been changed one way or the other, and there's a sort of distancing going on. And with Irenaeus' assumptions baked in, that looks like Irenaeus' assumptions about Marcion baked in, that looks like a rejection, Marcion's rejection of Jesus' relationship to the God of the Hebrew Bible. And you can see how Irenaeus would say, oh, that's too far, right? Like, that's comprehensible. Again, I'm not saying, like, I'm going to side with Irenaeus or Marcion here. I'm saying, like, we can understand why someone like Irenaeus would think this about a gospel that looks to us very similar. But, like, if you're asking me whether Marcion's gospel, in fact, destroys the essence of the gospel, I would just say, like, I don't believe in essences. I don't believe, and I think gists are interest relative. So it depends what you care about in a story to ask whether, like, it is, it keeps the gist, maintains the gist, or violates the gist. I think these are ways of talking about things, and they're meaningful, but, like, and people, my goal is to understand how the first readers of the Gospels, in their variety, and there were lots of different ones, but, like, one approach to looking at the multiplicity of Gospels in antiquity. And I think hypothesis is a missing piece in that conversation. But I don't think I can therefore tell you that this Gospel or this Gospel, preserves the true hypothesis, right? I don't believe in any such
Right.
thing.
Well, fair enough. Yeah, I think the goal for me is to understand rhetorically also what Irenaeus is doing. I mean, not in order to scold him, but I think in order to understand ancient polemics, because it seems to me that what's happening is that he's trading on an ambiguity in the term gospel, and he's saying that Marcion's gospel violates the hypothesis. But in that sense, I think he's not thinking of the actual text of Marcion's gospel, which I actually highly doubt Irenaeus ever read. I have no idea. He leaves to Tertullian and Epiphanius to follow that line, to actually go through Marcion's gospel. But I think the ambiguity that he trades on, and he does the same thing with the Valentinians, is he's no longer pointing out to their literal text. He's saying that the gospel in their heads, that is their theology, is what we would call their theology, is what is violating the hypothesis. Because, yes, according to Irenaeus, obviously, if you distinguish the creator from the true and supreme God, then you have violated the gospel. But gospel means there something like not the written text, but the notional theology in your head. And the same thing with the Valentinians. The Valentinians have the same exact gospels as Irenaeus does. I mean, they value Matthew, they value John, we don't know what relay they do with Mark, but that's true with most ancients. But they're using the same text, but what Irenaeus comments on as the violation is this story that isn't really the gospel story.
That's right.
But something like an interpretation or allegorization of it, which is this story of the pleroma, the 30 aeons and stuff like that. So it's that ambiguity which he's trading on. And it basically comes down to my theology doesn't agree with yours. I mean, if we could say that more neutral, but I wonder if I'm missing something. Go ahead.
I think you are. Just a couple distinctions that I think will bring out what I'm saying is slightly different from what you're saying. Not that I disagree with you. I think he makes that argument too, but he uses the rule of faith to make that argument. My theology disagrees with your theology. That's his rule of faith argument. For the argument that draws on hypothesis, he's actually drawing on an older anti-allegorical tradition of reading that goes back to Aristarchus and maybe Herodotus, depending on random fragments that are really hard to trace back. But he's drawing on a different line of argument. And it's an argument that is not about having the right text or the wrong text, but about practices of reading. And there's an older argument that appeals to the hypothesis, among other things, context as well and things like that, but appeals to like the gist of the story as a guide for reading any particular passage, and argues that allegorical interpretations, which were already sort of very prevalent for Homeric corpus, there's an argument against those sorts of allegorizations that says that doing that kind of allegory ignores the gist of the story, and so that reading is probably wrong. That's how the argument works. And that's actually not even, so that is one of the ways, there's another one I want to talk about as well, but that's one of the ways that Irenaeus draws on hypothesis language is part of this sort of established anti-allegorical argument. And then he uses the Kento to sort of illustrate what's going on here, which is the whole point, is the same text, different interpretation. The Kento is when you extract lines from sort of the Odyssey and the Iliad and you jumble them up to create a new story. So someone seems to have jumbled up the Odyssey lines from the Iliad and the Odyssey to tell the story of Hercules, which is not found anywhere, right? It's a combination of lines. And he's saying this is kind of like what the Valentinians do, is they are pulling random lines out of our Gospels, the same Gospels we have, according to Irenaeus, and coming up with a new story with those. And he says to do so is to substitute somebody else's hypothesis for the hypothesis of the Gospels. And this is his most explicit, this is one of the things that tipped me off, that like, oh, Irenaeus is definitely thinking with the Scholia. Like, not literally like he's got them in front of him, but he's thinking along the same lines, because he uses the term hypothesis to say, just like the dramatic tragedians, so too the Valentinians have actually stolen, he says the Valentinians have stolen their cosmogony from a comedic playwright, someone else who wrote a theogony, wrote a pagan theogony. And he first says they've just borrowed they've borrowed the story and substituted new characters. And he says, no, that's not even right. They've just changed the names. They're the same character. So what they've done is they've borrowed the hypothesis. So he's got to sort of pivot his position on whether it's different characters or new characters. And when he says or different characters are the same characters, and then when he says, oh, it's the same characters with different names, then he can say, oh, what they've done is they've borrowed the hypothesis from pagan theogonies and created this story of the pleroma, and then used our Gospels and made a Kento out of our Gospels to tell this pagan story. So he's all along the way drawing on these sort of literary theory ideas, the anti-allegorical argument of the Alexandrian grammarians, the explicit charge of retelling a story that's already been retold. He says, he says that retelling this comedic theogony, and then the sort of the image of the Kento throughout. It's very clearly this sort of classical literary theory argument.
Right. And I see that. I mean, obviously he is wanting to say I'm reading right and you're not.
Right.
But at the same time, I think if I was to imagine myself as a fly in the wall and Irenaeus and a Valentinian were in the room debating,
yep.
I think a Valentinian would say something like, you're confusing our story of the pleroma
Yep.
with what we think of as the hypothesis of the Gospels. The relationship of the story of the pleroma and the Gospels, that's actually not so clear. That's up for debate. But, in terms of, do they have the same story, the gist as Irenaeus?
Yep.
Are they reading Matthew? Do they have a basic, set of things which they imagine as essential to the life of Jesus? Well, I think they would. That would be,
Yeah.
birth, miracles, maybe, crucifixion, resurrection. They have that.
Yep.
And then, then the story of the pleroma, that's actually something quite different. And it's sort of like if someone were to then, 100 years after Irenaeus come to him and say, well, Irenaeus, you've violated the hypothesis because your story of the Antichrist and the millennium, and actually Eusebius pretty much comes close to saying this, isn't, that's not part of the gospel. So you must have violated the hypothesis. That would be equally unfair because I think Irenaeus would say, no, my hypothesis is that Jesus, it's sort of like a creedal statement. It's sort of like the rule of faith.
So I think you're making, so if you'll allow me, I think you're making the same mistake that most readers of Irenaeus have made, which is they've conflated his argument about the hypothesis with his argument about the rule of faith. And I think you're correctly characterizing the kind of thing that went on about the rule of faith. And like we could do the same, you're right. Eusebius could definitely charge Irenaeus with getting that wrong. But it's a different kind of argument. He's making a different kind of argument when he's doing the hypothesis thing. And it's specifically about techniques of reading. It's about how you're reading a text. So like, I don't actually disagree with anything you're saying. It's just you're using hypothesis where you should be saying rule of faith, canon, right? That's what which doesn't mean what we mean by canon, but that's the Greek word, right? It's the ruler. That's that argument. Hypothesis is much more specific for Irenaeus, and I think it's really clear. Hypothesis for Irenaeus means characters, settings, and events, just like it means in the Scholia. And he at one point even adumbrates this. He sort of lays out what the hypothesis of the Gospels was, and it's this place where people have said, this doesn't fit with Irenaeus's other expressions of the rule of faith. This one's all narrative. Frances Young has a piece where she says this one doesn't really fit well, and it's because it's not the rule of faith. He's actually this is the time he's expressing the hypothesis, where he lays out what he understands to be the basic narrative of the Gospels, and it's it's incarnation, virgin birth, miracles, ministry, death and resurrection, and prophesied second coming. Like that's it. So when he's accusing the Valentinians of ignoring or falsifying or breaking or somehow getting the hypothesis wrong, it's a different kind of argument. It's not your theology is wrong. It's you are reading this text in a way that ignores the gist of the text, and it's a classical anti-allegorical argument. It's you're not paying attention to the whole narrative. You're focusing on the particular vocabulary of one phrase. And I'm not interested in saying Irenaeus is right and the Valentinians are wrong. I hope you don't hear me saying that. I don't. That's not my conversation. I'm trying to draw attention that we've missed in reading Irenaeus. We've largely missed a kind of argument he's making. The closest person to this, Brigman's sort of drawn attention to this before me. That this is a distinct argument. This is not my theology versus your theology. This is my technique for reading, which is similar to let's say the Alexandrian grammarians, as opposed to your technique of reading, which is similar to the Alexandrian allegorists, right? It's an anti-allegorical argument. And it's not a coincidence that Origen doesn't like these kinds of readings. He only makes it once and he apologizes for making it. And then Epiphanius uses hypothesis arguments to argue against Origen. He explicitly invokes the hypothesis to argue against the history of allegorical interpretation of the scriptures. So like it's part of this wider sort of system of non-allegorical approaches to scripture, or at least the rhetoric of anti-allegory, which I know Irenaeus also engages in things that can be characterized that way. Like I'm aware of that, but it's part of a classic set of arguments is what I'm trying to say.
Sure, fair enough. But would you say that there's no relation between the rule of faith and a hypothesis? Because it seems to me that you would have a gist of the gospel story would look something like that rule of faith.
Yeah.
Jesus was born in a real body from the Virgin Mary, that he fulfills prophecies, that his Father is the creator, that he dies on a cross, and that he's raised. That's the hypothesis of the Gospels, but it's also the rule of faith. Would you disagree with that?
Well, I don't think that's exactly the rule of faith. The rule of faith, he gives us the rule of faith, right? He sort of lays it out. And so they're slightly different for Irenaeus. And previous readers had sort of noticed this problem before. You can check my footnotes for it. But I'm definitely not saying they're totally separate. But they're two different kinds of claims, and he uses different arguments to support them. So when he's trying to justify his rule of faith versus theirs, he knows it's just one set of assertions versus another's. So he makes different kinds of arguments, right? He appeals to the oral tradition handed down from the apostles, right? So what if we lost all our gospels argument, right? He makes different kinds of arguments to try to say, like, this is why my rule of faith is better. It's Catholic, it's universal, it goes back to the apostles, right? So he knows he's got to back that up with certain kinds of justifications. Whereas when it goes to the hypothesis argument, that is itself actually sort of the justification for his critique of Valentinian allegorizing, is you got to attend to the hypothesis rather than interpret minuscule details of one passage. And he backs that up only with other appeals to context. So he backs it up with, you've got to read this, within the rest of the verse, or with what comes after a paragraph later. So he makes a different sort of style of argument, because it's a different sort of like logic. You're absolutely right that his idea of what the Gospels are really about is obviously connected to his idea of what is true theology. So, like, yeah, I'm not like disagreeing with that. But it's not. In some ways, it's not what I care about, I guess. Or it's not that it's not what I care about. It's the argument I'm trying to draw attention to is that readers of Irenaeus for 100 years have collapsed these into each other. And Irenaeus is actually making two distinct kinds of arguments that assumes this important category of a hypothesis that people have people have translated away. You can go read William's translation of Epiphanius, and he has to rearrange the whole grammar to because he doesn't have a way to translate this word, because he doesn't know what's going on, so he just kind of skips it. There's a brilliant translation in general. I'm not critiquing that translation overall. I think it's done lots of great work. But there's a history of people reading the interpretation of the Gospels, missing that this is a sort of operative term in Hellenistic literary theory, and so misreading Irenaeus, and misreading Epiphanius, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I care about, I guess. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not saying that Irenaeus and Valentinians aren't actually disagreeing about theology. It's just I'm trying to draw attention to the distinction there, and not use hypothesis to mean just theology. It means sort of narrative arc, right?
Right. Well, it's okay if you do. I mean, we're just trying to understand here. So let's turn to your article. So your article is on Marcion, the text critic, and my understanding is that should be coming out real soon.
I thought it'd be out by now.
Oh, okay. But all right. Well, that's coming out from the Journal of Early Christian Studies, and that I'm wondering if you can give us just an elevator summary of that, because I think that what you're saying here. It was amazing when I read it, because it was like a synchronicity experience. So I wrote my book on Marcion basically last year this time. Okay. I've been waiting over a year for Fortress to publish it, which is frustrating, and I'm sure you're going through the same thing. Yep. But I came to the exact same conclusion that you did, and then I read your article 9 months later, and I was like, wow. We must have been thinking this at exactly the same time. This has happened before to me, and I'm just very pleased that you've been able to lay this out more fully. But can you give us an elevator summary of the article? Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the history of scholarship on Marcion, at people who assume Marcion is in some way responsible for the shape of the gospel attributed to him, which I'm just sort of bracketing for the purposes of this article. So if we look at those people, the whole history, all the way from Adolf Harnack up through Judith Liu, up through Sebastian Moll, the history of scholars who write on Marcion's gospel and assume he is responsible for the shape of that gospel. Over and over and over again, they latch on to this characterization of Marcion that shows up in Tertullian and in Origen in particular, as an emendator, or as a diorthotes. The Greek is escaping me exactly, but it's basically a corrector. And they grab this and say, look, these people are conceding that Marcion is some kind of textual scholar. They're calling him a corrector, and then proceeding to show, like, look how terrible of a job he did at correction, right? That's how they go on. He's mutilated the text. He thought he was a corrector, but he's not. And they say, look, this is a way we can understand how Marcion must have thought about what he was doing,
and or how the early readers of Marcion would have understood this product of this new gospel coming on the market relative to the Gospel of Luke, right? That's the kind of thing. He must have thought of himself as a textual critic. He's engaging in textual criticism as it was understood in antiquity. And Robert Grant has published like 3 things on this, including a whole chapter in one of his books dedicated completely to understanding Marcion in light of ancient textual criticism. The Alexandrians, obviously, so Xenodotus and Aristophanes of Byzantium and Aristarchus of Samothrace, as well as Galen and his practice of textual criticism, which is very complicated. But so there's this long history of scholars doing this. And so my argument is, if you look at how textual criticism was practiced in antiquity, it is the point of it, what makes it distinct from doing anything else with texts, is over and over it's emphasized that what the Alexandrians developed when they invented what people think of as emendatio, as people think of as the correction of texts, what they developed was a way to record problems in the text and proposed solutions to those problems without changing the received text. That textual criticism in antiquity is constituted by conservatism. It is the ability to record a problem and a solution to the problem without changing it, by passing things along. And this is reflected, we don't really care, for the purposes of understanding Marcion, we don't really care what the Alexandrians actually did in the 3rd century BCE, 2nd century BCE. There's a sort of history of them, right? That isn't actually what's important. For the record, I think it actually probably is the case that they didn't make any changes. They had a received text that they annotated. There's arguments in my footnotes to that effect. But that doesn't really much matter. What really matters is how people in the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century remembered what they did and how they imitated it. And if you look at sources from that period about the Alexandrians, really consistently, the thing that's notable about them is they didn't change the text as they received it. And there's an established polemic, whether it's in Galen or about the sort of received corpus of Aristotle, which is very complicated. There's this received polemic about frauds, about hucksters, tricksters, people who are trying to profiteer, and every once in a while, just a really stupid guy, just an idiot who doesn't know what he's doing. That what they do, they fix the text. They don't pass along the received corrupted text. They fix it and give it to you in the fixed form. And then they're, because of that makes them frauds. That makes them bad scholars, and sometimes morally bad, right? Of course. And so my suggestion is that this is exactly what Tertullian and Origen are doing. Is they're just participating in the same sort of discourse, the same convention of saying, Marcion. So on their assumption, they've got Luke and Marcion, and they know Marcion has to come second. And they know what he's done is delete stuff. And so by calling him an emendator, they're not putting him into a category into which he fits naturally as part of the intellectual culture of the 2nd century. They're slotting him into a category according to which he is an abysmal and explicit failure, in which he breaks the central rule of the central ethic of textual criticism, which is you preserve the old text, the received reading. And so he's being a bad scholar. And of course, that's exactly what Origen and Tertullian want to tell you, right? They want to say he's failing at this. He's an idiot. That's what they want you to believe. So by calling him an emendator, or by calling him a critic, a textual critic of some kind, they're not giving him an honorific. They're saying, think about his activity in this way, and you'll see he's clearly a failure. And this is explicit in Origen, who is accusing a different set of opponents of falsifying his own a debate that he was part of. And he's saying, they're acting like a bad textual critic, like Marcion, who's also a bad textual critic. It's explicitly in this context of the people he's debating with think they're doing some sort of literary composition. They're writing up this debate, and he says, no, you're not being literary critics. You're not composing new works. You are being bad textual critics. So that's not how they understand themselves. That's how he wants them to be understood. And likewise, he says the same thing for Marcion. And for Origen at that point, it's just given. There's no debate about Marcion in Origen's context. He's just obviously a corrupter of texts, right? The basic point is that textual criticism is not doing what Marcion was doing. And so Irenaeus wants you to think about him as a textual critic precisely because he fails at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've well said it. So a couple of things that I'll just point out just to kind of promote this thesis, which I think is absolutely the case, and which in some ways I find a little bit humorous, because modern scholars, you get the sense that Robert Grant and Christoph Markschies, they want to do Marcion a favor by like rehabilitating him as a text critic. And, you know, there's no evidence like from Marcion's mouth or even from any other Marcionite that they portrayed him as a text critic. It's only the heresiologists. But what's interesting is, like, yeah, Grant and Markschies, they go back, as you've done, to like the Alexandrian venerable tradition of text criticism, and they think that by portraying Marcion as a text critic, they honor him, or they at least put him in a context in which he would be valued. But ironically, as you rightly point out, that's just buying the heresiological line and then flipping the values of it, and that's no good. You mentioned two theories about how two heresiological theories about how Marcion, came up with or published his gospel. I think we need to be very careful about our language here. But in one theory, he basically writes it. He's an evangelist himself, and interestingly, Marcus Vincent has more or less run with this in the modern period, and to a certain extent, Matthias Klinghardt, that Marcion is actually the writer of the first gospel. And this is amazing because it also buys the heresiological position. Of course, it modifies it in a way that's, honoring to Marcion or sympathetic to Marcion, but it is the heresiological position. And then, of course, the other position is that he's a text critic and emendator who's consciously going through Luke and deleting all the stuff that doesn't agree with his theology. Both of those are heresiological. Both of those, I think, just to lay down my cards, are gravely wrong, and deeply, deeply wrong. But I shouldn't bias the conversation.
No, it's fine.
I think that, it's the duty of scholars, I think, and Jason Badun has really, I think, done the best work on this. But I think it's the duty of scholars to come up with a theory that does not reinscribe that heresiological discourse. And I think Badun and I are basically agreed that, there's some nuances there, but that Marcion inherits a gospel, that he doesn't view himself as an evangelist. He doesn't view himself as inspired by the Holy Spirit. He wouldn't view himself as apostolic. His apostle is Paul. So even if he did get something like canonical Luke placed in his hands, and even if he did think that that was distorted in some way, I'm not sure he would have said, I have the apostolic authority to produce a new gospel based on, what I think is the hypothesis, to use your term. But anyway, I guess my final question is, and you can feel free to punt on this, but what are your senses of what would be Marcion's own self-representation here? I know that the data is gapped, but have you thought about this, or do you care to come up with any thoughts?
Yes, I have. And I'm not going to give you my full answer today because I'm hoping this is a book down the road. But I will say, I will push you on one point and sort of hint at what my answer is, which is I don't think you've accurately characterized the data on the other heresiological account of Marcion, which is what I just want to make one nuance that I think makes all the difference, that makes a difference for me. And that specifically is Irenaeus, which is our first source, very plausibly. I mean, I know there's some other little fragments and things that people think might be alluding to Marcion or not, like Dionysius of Corinth or something. But in general, let's say Irenaeus is our first, extended discussion of Marcion's gospel. And what he doesn't do what Tertullian does, right? So we both agree that Tertullian and Origen both want to say that Marcion is an emendator and he sucks at it, right? That's what they want you to believe about him. Irenaeus doesn't do the same thing about Marcion being an evangelist. He doesn't say you should think of Marcion as an evangelist. He says that Marcion purports to be an evangelist. He says Marcion wants his followers to trust him more than the disciples, right? And I don't think Marcion said exactly that by any means. So I'm not going that far. I'm not buying the sort of that part of the rhetoric. But Irenaeus wants to deny it explicitly, right? He wants to say, but this is not the case. Marcion is not an evangelist. He wants to deny him that title, which is a difference, right? There is a subtle difference. If the equivalent would be Tertullian or saying Marcion pretends to be an emendator, but he's not. Don't think of him as an emendator. Now, Tertullian is very happy for you to think of Marcion as an emendator because he's not doing that. But Irenaeus is different. Irenaeus says you don't think of him as an evangelist because what he wrote isn't really a gospel. And that is a slight difference. And I'm going to be arguing someday that I do think, for reasons that don't have to do with just the sort of heresiological data, for some reasons that I think are internal to the text, I do think that our best explanation, given the really crappy data, well, even before personally to Marcion, somebody composed this gospel and in a way that makes it distinct from the Gospel of Luke. There's sequential issues that are going on there that are complicated, but I think someone had to compose this gospel using something that looked something like the received text of Luke. And then I do think the best explanation, and this is a sort of lower level of confidence, is that the best explanation is that it was probably Marcion. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I don't think he thinks of himself as doing the same kind of thing that Irenaeus thinks Luke was doing, because I don't think that category exists yet. The sort of category of gospel author in that way exists yet. I think he's participating in an earlier discourse along with people, an earlier sort of way of thinking about texts and the production of texts that we see in pre-Irenaean authors and a few post-Irenaean authors. But I'm going to sort of save that. I sort of hinted that at the end of the article, and we can, talk about that more someday down the road. So I'm not sort of just defending Irenaeus here. I don't think Irenaeus is just right. I think there is something meaningfully different in how Marcion or whoever made that gospel, how they were thinking about these texts and authorship. But it isn't just that. But it also isn't that they're just wrong. But that's a conversation for another day, I suppose.
Yeah. So I think a more neutral way of saying it is that whoever wrote the text of Marcion's gospel wrote it so that it would be distinct, not from Luke, which we can't say existed, but distinct from other gospels which were available. We don't know if Luke was even available. So I think that what we can say is that, yes, I mean, obviously it's a conscious product of human intelligence. It looks a lot different than what we think of as like Mark, but not extremely. And it looks different than, Matthew. But again, maybe not in terms of the hypothesis.
No, I think you're right about that. And that's where we definitely agree. Is I do think whoever composed this thing probably thought it's more like it's on the same hypothesis as the previous gospels. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I would just say, well, obviously, in time to come, you'll be able to read my own work on this. But I think the idea of Marcion as an author, I haven't seen a shred of evidence for that would actually come from an actual Marcionite.
No.
But I think that, it's interesting. Two things to consider is, first, Justin Martyr is the first to attack Marcion.
Yes.
He says that he writes a whole book against Marcion. And he doesn't apparently mention any of this, either Marcion as text critic or Marcion as author. Now,
Correct.
Admittedly, that's an argument from silence. But the other point to keep in mind is that Tertullian...
But it's a meaningful silence. I think it's an important silence.
Yeah.
And this is part of my argument. Is I think Justin thinks about gospels differently. And so you're exactly right. But go on.
Okay. And then Tertullian, if you look at Marcus Vincent, who has been pushing the line of Marcion as author, it's actually Tertullian that he's mainly dependent on. I think he misses this passage from Irenaeus that you've brought up.
I don't find Vincent's work very compelling. But
yeah, well, it's Tertullian who also portrays Marcion as an evangelizator. That is an evangelist. But yeah, I think the struggle is always, it's not necessarily to say something different from the heresiologists. I'll give you that. But I think the struggle is to really get the insider perspective from the Marcionite side and give due weight to that. And admittedly, all that must be a reconstruction, because in fact, that doesn't exist. So it's not like we are, have a non-heresiological source. But I think that we do have good reconstructions of the Gospels. And so that's where I would like to begin. Good reconstructions of Marcion's Gospel.
Yeah.
And I think, that's where we could get some actual hard data and work this through. But at any rate, I think as you mentioned, this is a longer debate, and of course, I myself look forward to whatever you come up with, and I hope that you'll let me know and let everyone know as you work this out. And I do think that, yeah, it's a fantastic having you on this particular channel, and I for one eagerly await both the article and the book. Ian was kind enough to give me just sort of like the off print of it in proofs, and so I can attest that it is excellent scholarship, and I want to make sure that everyone knows that. So Ian, how else can we promote you? What else do you want people to know about?
You've been extremely kind. Thank you so much for having me on. I look forward also to reading your Marcion book, and maybe we can have a conversation in some interesting venue about it someday down the road. The only other thing to plug besides my Hypothesis of the Gospels book is I run a podcast. I co-host a podcast with Laura Robinson that isn't a new books podcast or a latest scholarship podcast. It's an old books podcast. So we started it in grad school when we were doing our comps together, and there were all these new podcasts that were blowing up that were sort of new books in the field stuff, and those are great and wonderful, but we thought, wouldn't it be great to have a podcast that just goes over the really old stuff that everyone has to cite anyways and that you have to study for comps if you're a graduate student? And so we created one. It's called the New Testament Review, and we New Testament Review, and we introduce, survey, do our best to contextualize, and then when possible talk about the reception of formative pieces of scholarship. And we sort of observe a rough 20-year rule for the sort of headline piece, but then, of course, discuss how that piece has been received. So, for instance, we have an episode on Adolf Harnack's old book, classic book on Marcion. And we talk about Sebastian Moll's reception of that book. And we talk about all sorts of people, how they've read that book differently over the years. Because, of course, that book is deeply problematic. But everyone still has to cite it. And so if you want an introduction to sort of old works of New Testament scholarship that are all dated, but all important, that's a resource for the viewers. So thanks, David, for letting me plug it. And we make $0 off it. I lose $14 a month on it. So it's mostly just a passion project for making connections with interesting people. So
excellent. Well, I'm sure that's very useful, and I will have links to that or whatever, so that people can access that. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ian. Good work, and keep it up. And maybe we'll see each other on the next round as we pursue this amazing, study in this amazing field, which is often underplayed. But yeah, happy to have you in it and as a colleague. So thank you again.
Thanks.
And,
thanks so much.
Thank you to everyone.